Thank you all for being here. We're doing kind of the second educational session in this series to help better understand the horseshoe crab ARM, the Adaptive Resource Management Framework in the Delaware Bay region, and prep us for the upcoming workshop that we're going to do at the end of January. Hopefully you attended or at least reviewed the recording of the first educational session that we did back in December. If not, I think that's still available and we can get that to you. But this is functionally a repeat of what we did on Monday. Maybe one or two of you might be, I think it's mostly new people today, but anyway, yeah. We just wanted to offer multiple sessions since it was kind of hard to schedule these with you all. But this is going to be a repeat of content from Monday in case anyone was there for that. Although the question and answer session, which there'll be a good amount of time for that, will be different, of course. Well, let's dive in, everyone. All right, well, welcome again to these educational sessions. Broadly speaking, we have a couple of objectives, reasons why we're doing this. One is to keep building a bit of a shared understanding of what the management context is for this ARM framework and the specific context and goals of this particular process that we're doing right now. The second bullet here is a real focus of the day, and that's to review and understand some of the values-based components of the ARM framework. Particularly, we're talking about components of things called the utility, reward, and harvest functions, and really allow for again, that Q&A and some dialogue between the modelers and some of the people who have been developing these over the years and the rest of you participants. And then finally, we want to use these as kind of a foundation of understanding to launch into a stakeholder multi-group workshop that we have at the end of the month to elicit values and update some of those values-based components of the ARM to better sort of support and reflect the values that exist right now among these groups. All right, so at this point, maybe I'll invite some of the planning team members to turn their cameras on, and I think everyone probably knows these folks by now, but just to recap some of the people behind the scenes who have been planning and organizing this process and doing a lot more than that with the ARM over the years. From ASMFC, we have Caitlin Starks, Tony Kearns, and Samara Nehemiah. From the ARM subcommittee members, we have some of those members here today. John Suika, you heard from in the first educational session. Jim Lyons, USGS is on that committee. And then two folks that you'll hear a lot more from today are Connor McGowan and Brian News. And then finally, you have me and Katie O'Donnell. We're facilitators from Compass Resource Management who kind of specialize in these multi-group SDM and adaptive management processes, and happy to be here. Planning team. So the details of today, really one main session that we'll go through. We'll hear some presentations around that do a little bit of a deeper dive than we did last time into the values-based functions of the ARM. We'll talk through the utility, reward, and harvest functions, especially how they've been updated over time and ultimately what they do in that current form, and then have a lot of time for Q&A, do a little bit of wrap up at the end, and prepare for that upcoming workshop. So that's the plan. Okay, so before we launch into the deep dive of the values-based functions, again, we kind of wanted to recap a few basic things about this process and the framework as a whole. And it's always good to go back to the beginning and really be clear about what the frame of this framework actually is. What's the objective that it's trying to achieve? And for the horseshoe crab ARM framework, it's this statement here: managing harvest of horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay to maximize that harvest, but also maintain ecosystem integrity. And one thing that means is providing adequate stopover habitat for migrating shorebirds and assuring that the abundance of horseshoe crabs is not limiting red knot stopover population size or recovery. So some key kind of regulatory or decision-making context details to highlight here is that the ASMFC Management Board is the decision maker for this harvest problem, and they have authority over how many horseshoe crabs are harvested in the bay. Habitat conservation decisions are obviously linked, but those decisions are much broader than this specific frame, and they kind of fall outside the purview of ASMFC, although there's an obvious linkage there. But in terms of decision making, that's a bit broader of a process. And red knot recovery, of course, is under the purview of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So thinking about kind of that decision, that scope, that frame, there's things that are definitely going to be a focus in this process, and then there's things that are sort of outside the focus of what we really want to focus on here. Some of those things that are kind of prior decisions that have already been made that we're not going to spend a lot of time on in this process is anything involving the underlying population assessment science that goes into the structure. So all the science behind estimating horseshoe crab population dynamics or red knot population dynamics. Also, past management decisions are those are already in place and not going to be a focus to kind of relitigate or discuss those too much. But what is going to be the focus is what we're going to talk about today, and that's those values-based components of the model. So we really want to spend some time with y'all hearing what are these groups' values and how can they be better reflected in the functions of the utility, reward, and harvest functions in the ARM. So there's obviously connections like between the science components and the values components. We'll talk a little bit about that. But we're going to prioritize these values-based components in this process and earmark certain things that are remaining uncertainties or remaining things that we want to that link to those values components, but we can sort of mark where the uncertainties are and come back to them after this process. But it's just the nature of we can't do everything all at once, and this is a really iterative process. That's kind of what adaptive management is all about, and we'll actually talk about that in a second. So one thing we showed last time was this conceptual model that represents the ARM as a whole and breaks it apart basically into two sort of areas. One is more the technical science-based components. These are what we talked about in the first educational session, and that was really about, what's all the science and models that go into predicting how horseshoe crab populations are behaving now and in the future, and ditto for red knot populations now and in the future. We also started talking about the right side of this diagram, which are the values-based functions that will be the focus of today. A little bit recap of session one, just in case it's been a while or you forgot what we talked about there. Some of the highlights were that, again, yes, the ARM includes those two types of components, technical and values-based. It uses best available science and has undergone independent peer reviews and multiple updates. We'll hear about some of those updates today and how the values-based components have been changed over time. So far, based on available data, the ARM's predictions have been pretty good and pretty aligned with the data that we see out there, which is encouraging. And then, a final reminder that we'll talk about a lot today is that really the ARM harvest recommendations, what recommendations and decisions are coming out of the ARM framework is trying to maximize the long-term conditions for both horseshoe crab harvest and red knot abundance. Not just the short-term gains, but really taking that long view of how can we have a sustainable horseshoe crab fishery over the long term and meet these ecosystem needs as well. So that's a bit about what we talked about last time. And we want to do one more thing before we get into the deeper dive of the values-based functions. And that's to really go back to the foundation of adaptive management. What is it and what is it kind of based on? And what's the foundation of this whole framework? And to do that, we just have a couple slides to go over these basics if you aren't familiar with that. So first, I just want to talk about this concept called structured decision-making, which really is the basis of an adaptive resource management framework. So SDM, as we call it, is really a way to break down complex problems into this series of steps. And it's been used really effectively for all sorts of thorny natural resource management problems. problems. In decomposing the problem into this series of steps, what it does really well, or one of the things it does really well, is separate those science-based components and values-based components. For example, our objectives, what do we care about? What do we want to accomplish? That's a very values-based question versus what do we predict is going to happen under different management actions? That's where we gather all the best available information and is a very science-based component of the process. Finally, structured decision-making kind of in its simplest form goes once around this wheel and implements kind of a one-time decision, but it doesn't have to. And so adaptive resource management is when we repeat decisions over time and learn as we go. So the kind of arrows that go back in the process represent an adaptive management process like the one we're focused on today. Year to year, they might, you might implement a decision, evaluate the consequences, and then next year implement a different decision. And then there's also arrows kind of where adaptive management can go even further back in the process and update, maybe our objectives have changed, maybe our alternatives have changed. And certainly thinking about how we update those values-based components is what we're doing in this process. Just linking it a little more clearly to this horseshoe crab context, the decision context is harvest management decisions from ASMFC. The alternatives are the range of harvest quotas that we might implement. The consequences are kind of what we talked about in session 1, where we're using science to predict what's going to happen for horseshoe crabs and red knots and using those population models to predict consequences. And then, like I said, the iteration, the adaptive management part of it is reflected in those annual harvest decisions and then bigger updates to some of these components like we're doing now. So hopefully that was helpful for just going back to the basics, talking about sort of the foundational concepts of the ARM framework. And we're now going to turn to talking about the concepts of utility and reward and harvest in more detail. Before I turn it over to the true experts in this and talk through how the ARM functions, let's do a quick primer on what do we mean by utility, what do we mean by reward, because already it's a little jargony and we want to make sure everyone understands. So for utility, when I say that, what we really mean in the terms of adaptive management, utility means the value or desirability of a given outcome. And it's a really crucial and interesting component of this because it basically links what is going to happen, the science-based component of the model, like maybe species abundance, with how happy we are, kind of that values-based component. And that's really important because ultimately the how happy we are is kind of how we make decisions. So it reflects, happiness, satisfaction, desirability, whatever you call it, relative to a given outcome that we're seeing in the system. And it relates to one objective or a single objective at a time. And there can be different shapes of these utility curves, kind of as you see here. It could be the more is, maybe you're just whatever, more is better kind of pattern, or there's a more nuanced curve that better represents your values given these states of the system. So utility refers to a single objective, but what if we have more than one objective? So just to go through a way too simple example, let's say you're buying a car and you narrowed it down to, for whatever reason, you really want a RAV4, and you're really just deciding between these different types of RAV4s. You care about miles per gallon, you care about kind of, that objective, and you care about cost. So if we were just thinking about one objective at a time, you would say, obviously, as miles per gallon goes up, you're happier. So you might like this one the best. But for cost, it's the opposite. You like the least cost the best, all else being equal. So how do you decide? Well, there's probably a way you can eyeball it and maybe sort of do the mental math about what's the best balance or what you value most. But there's a bit of a formal mathematical way to combine these and determine what the best option is. And that's what we call rewards, or a reward function. And that's just the sum total desirability, or it's sort of the sum representation of how good an option is given the set of outcomes across objectives. So as opposed to utilities, which focus on one objective, this is summing across all objectives and saying overall, this is your reward, or this is on average how good that option is. So just to highlight it or illustrate it a little bit here, remember, let's say for these two objectives, we do what we saw in the utility slides, where we take the expected outcome and translate it to how happy we are for that objective. Do that for both objectives independently. And then all we do is add it together to get a reward. The only additional thing we need to do is think about how important each of these objectives is relative to one another. And that could change person to person, context to context. And so we just put a little weight on each of these objectives to give a more nuance to how important each one is relative to the other. And it's just a simple kind of weighting of the utility values to sum up our total reward for how good each option is. Okay, so utility refers to how happy we are for a single objective, and a reward value is kind of the overall happiness for that option given its performance across multiple objectives. All right, the last thing we're going to say for these is, and you'll hear this repeated, I think, for both Connor and Brian in a second, but again, we're taking kind of a long-term approach when thinking about reward or happiness in a framework like the ARM. The ARM really focuses on long-term rewards and not just what is the most we could get out of the system in a short-term sense. Kind of a picture examples of what this could look like is if you have a family and have a certain budget, and you want to blow it all this summer on a really extravagant vacation, you could totally do that, and it would be really fun probably, but maybe you don't have a lot of money for the next vacation, and your long-term plans and happiness might be impacted. So that's kind of the short-term thinking versus that long-term thinking that we're doing here, which is, you could think of it as maybe going on a small vacation, but really putting a lot into a college fund for your child. Okay, so that's just sort of the framing and the framework that we're entering here, and how we sort of determine what's a good outcome and what's a less good outcome. So for the rest of this presentation, we're going to break it down into kind of two parts. Connor McGowan is going to talk about the more original or older version of the ARM framework, particularly the utility, reward, and harvest functions. And then Brian Neuse is going to talk about the new versions and how they've been updated and currently exist. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Connor.
Hey everyone, I hope you can hear me. I've got my camera on and my mic on. For those that don't know me, my name is Connor McGowan. I'm with the U.S. Geological Survey in the Co-op Unit program in Florida. And I've been working on the Horseshoe crab red knot adaptive management planning and program for a very long time. I started this as a postdoc in 2008, and I have been involved with it since back then. So my task today is to present to you the old ways. I prefer the original ways. Something about the word old is bothering me these days, but we'll get past that. We'll stick with the title on the slide. And my goal is to try to describe to you the original utility functions and the a reward function and a little bit how they work, well, how we arrived at those functions and how they work, and then talk about how they combine into the reward function as well. Before I get into those, I just wanted to mention that these were product, what I'm presenting to you is sort of the end point, but they were the product of many stakeholder meetings, public meetings, stakeholder meetings, where we facilitated discussion and arrived at these utility curves and then reward function as a result of that stakeholder engagement. We tried a number of different avenues for articulating how we value the system. Things like, should we consider extinction probability for red knots as part of the utility and the reward function, or should we consider population growth? And for both species, we ended up focusing on abundance for a variety of reasons. But I just wanted to let you know that ultimately what you're seeing is the end product of a whole series of efforts to elicit and facilitate discussion with a variety of participants. So we can go to the next slide and start to look at what that product was. This is the final reward function that we had in place, and it precipitates pretty well out of Brian's presentation of reward functions. What we have are two components of this reward function. The female harvest is on the left, with a utility term, and then the male harvest components are on the right. And I'm going to walk through each of the utility curves for both of those sides. I will say as we get into it that it is focused on harvest. The number of animals harvested is what ultimately gives you reward as modified by that utility. And that's, again, Brian said this earlier as well, that this is all part of the ASMFC's harvest planning process, and so harvest was at the core of what we were doing back then, and I think still now. So I think if you click forward, we'll see that the pink, the female utility value is highlighted in purple, excuse me. And so that's just indicating that we're going to walk through the female utility curves. So these are graphical depictions of the utility curves. And so just like the curves that Brian showed earlier, on the y-axis on the left, it shows utility. And utility is a sort of jargony word for happiness or satisfaction. And then on the x-axis on the bottom are the state of the system, the metrics of the system that we're interested in. And so as red knot abundance or as female horseshoe crab abundance increases, utility changes as that abundance increases. And so we set our utility curves up as if they were constraining elements on the harvest, which, if you might remember from the previous slide, the utility is multiplied by the harvest. And so in both cases, we have up to a point, there is no utility of harvest, up to a point for both red knot abundance and female abundance. And then at some point, we hit a threshold and the utility increases to full value. So we've got highlighting that on both of these. You can put the other one up as well. So I wanted to start by talking about the red knot utility threshold. It was set at 81,900 red knots, and that is ostensibly because the stakeholders and the participants at the time were very interested or wanted very deeply to try and restore the red knot population and the shorebird stopover as a whole to some state in the past. They wanted to increase abundances back to what they were 10 or 15 years before much of this management effort got started. So sometime in the early 90s or late 80s is what they had in mind. And their vision was that there was much higher abundances at that time, and they wanted to try and manage the system so that the abundance would increase to that point. And so 81,900 knots was selected as the target, and the selection of that target was complicated and semi-negotiated, but everybody in the end agreed on this 81,900 target threshold for knots. However, there was concern that if we restricted harvest and managed the system to get 81,900 knots before allowing value or putting value or utility on female horseshoe crab harvest, that we could end up in a place where we were restricting harvest or applying no utility to female harvest. And red knots never actually reached that threshold. So a secondary threshold was put in place on female horseshoe crab harvest. It was set at 11.2 million crabs. So if we get to 11.2 million crabs, we go from 0 utility to 1 full utility. And that was set as a sort of backup that if red knots did not respond to our efforts to manage the system, eventually, if we had that many crabs, we would feel comfortable harvesting, and therefore the harvest would have utility at that point. These were an or statement. So if either of these two conditions were met, the utility was 1. And if neither of them were met, the utility was then 0. So that was set up to try and account for a little bit of uncertainty and a backup plan, basically, if red knots did not respond. So I think that's what I had for this slide, and we can go on. So then that utility value is plugged into this reward equation. And so the number of females harvested, or that could be harvested, would be multiplied by utility. And presumably, you know, if they were below those thresholds, you would get a 0. And if one of those two populations was above that threshold, you would get a 1. And then we multiplied female harvest by 2, because at that time, at least, on the sales market, females were just more valuable. Fishermen believed or argued that females are a better bait source, and that you could sell them for a higher price than you could males. In addition to them just being larger than the males, typically they were also more valuable on the bait market. So that 2 almost acts like a weight, like Brian was talking about earlier, how you can add weight and have one term in your reward function be more valuable or more important than the other. Effectively, that 2 is functioning like a weight in this case. So I think we'll move on now to talking about the male utility functions, which functioned similarly in the reward equation, in that they were a multiplier on the amount of harvest, but the utility curve itself was slightly more complicated. It was based on sex ratio observed on the spawning beaches in Delaware and New Jersey. And the idea here is that if we had enough males to ensure full fertility, then extra males could be valued or could have utility in a harvest. And so the idea was to set a similar threshold where below an efficient sex ratio or a necessary sex ratio, there would be no utility to harvesting males. And then above that threshold, or above that that critical ratio, you would have full utility for males harvest. However, there was uncertainty in what the required or necessary sex ratio was at the time. Some laboratory or very controlled experiments showed that a 2-to-1 male to female ratio on a spawning beach was sufficient for full fertility. Other genetics data indicated that on spawning beaches, multiple males were fertilizing single nests. And so it was thought that maybe you actually need more males to get full fertility in the population. So we created these 2 points on this curve and have a diagonal line linking them together. So we have 0 utility below 2-to-1 males to female on a spawning beach. It linearly increases thereafter. And then once we get to 3-to-1 males to female on a spawning beach, there's full utility thereafter. So that is then taken and input into the reward equation, which I think we'll look at on the next slide. And to exemplify how this works, we thought we would look at a tangible example of the year 2018 and demonstrate how utility is derived from the populations, and then how that utility is applied to the harvest packages to then estimate the expected reward from harvest for that year. So the table below shows the measured state of the system for both species and the actual harvest that was collected in that year. And I think it first highlights the harvest amounts. We see from the table on the bottom right that 0 females were harvested, so that we get a 0 in that slot. Keep clicking through if you don't mind. The male harvest was 500,000 males, and so that goes into that term in the equation. And then we have to look at the actual abundances to determine what the utility was in that year, and for males and for female harvest. So for females, we had an estimated 6.6 million female crabs in the bay, or in the bay derived population in that year, and that was estimated by the Virginia Tech Offshore Trawl, and we had an estimated 49,405 red knots from the mark recapture data. And I think we're going to show the utility curves if we click on the slide. So the idea here is to try to identify where on the curves these two abundance estimates fall, and the 6.6 million females shows up here where the A is indicating, so you can see it's below that 11.2 million threshold, giving it a 0 utility. But again, this is an or statement, so if the red knots were above the threshold, we would look at them, but they have just slightly under 50,000 red knots, so the B is indicating where the red knots fall. And so our utility for 2018 for female harvest would have been 0. So we put that into the equation. And now we can look at the male utilities. And this is an issue of looking at the male abundance compared to the female abundance to estimate that sex ratio in the population. And just at first glance, you can see that they are pretty well above the 3-to-1 ratio, and we could confirm that with some quick math and looking at our charts. I mean, at our figures. We need about 18 million males to 6 million females to hit that 3-to-1 ratio. And so we are above that 3-to-1 ratio. So male utility in 2018 would have been a 1. And then it's just a matter of carrying through this equation to see what utility would have been. 0 times 0 times 2 is still 0. And then 500,000 times 1 is 500,000. So our reward in 2018 with harvest package 5 would have been 500,000. You could see how plugging in each of the harvest packages that we had in the system at that time would have given you different levels of reward. Any of the female harvest packages would have given you 0 reward. And so then the male packages would have given you increasing amounts of reward in the system, and the program settled on 500,000 males as the most valuable outcome in this case. So I say that I went through that example. Maybe go back real quick if you don't mind. I went through that example, and I just wanted to note a couple of things. One, this is a single time step, and we're presenting it as a single time step just to exemplify how the reward function might work. But this is also retrospective. So we didn't actually pick the harvest package first and then calculate rewards. What it does is it tests the algorithm tests the different packages under these different states of the system to determine what the best reward is given those conditions. And the other thing that it does is that it doesn't really do it year by year, time step by time step. The algorithm attempts to tell you what to do in any state of the system. So no matter how many any amount of red knots that you have, and any amount of female crabs, and any amount of male crabs that you have, the algorithm goes through all of those possible combinations of abundances and reports to you what the best possible management action is given the current state. So now we can go on to the next slide and highlight that it's not only doing it for 1 year at a time, it's doing all of those calculations for hundreds or even thousands of years into the future to try and say, if you wanted to have 81,900 red knots in the future and this many horseshoe crabs in the future, this is the harvest strategy that you should implement now, given how many crabs and how many knots you have in the system. So the algorithm is a lot more complicated in terms of how many of these utilities it's extracting and applying and calculating a reward. It's a lot more complicated in terms of how many times it's doing that. But the steps are really, really similar. It's taking the abundances, it's comparing them to the utility curves, and then implementing them into this reward function to predict what the best action would be, or determine what the best action would be. So what I think that's all we had to say here. What we end up with here, we take those states of the system and these are the harvest packages that we had implemented into our harvest management plan, our adaptive management plan at the time. And so you can kind of see how you could plug in each of these harvest packages into the reward function as we did with the 2018 data. And I think I mixed up my packages earlier. I'm sorry, I misspoke. I meant package 3 and I said package 5. I think I said package 5 because it is 500,000 crabs. And my brain got latched onto the number 5 there. So sorry about that. Package 3 is what we would have picked and what we did pick in 2018. So these are the alternatives that we implement, and then we test those out in the reward functions with the utility curves to identify the best harvest strategy. What that ended up leading to under that old system, I believe is shown on the next slide, is basically an all or nothing harvest strategy where we effectively were harvesting 500,000 male onlys right up until we hit that threshold, and then it switched immediately to the full harvest of 210,000 females and 420 or so thousand males. Very, very rarely did the system pick those other harvest packages that we offered to the system. And when it did pick them, it was usually in really, really weird states of the system, like when your sex ratios were really far off. Sometimes you were harvesting more females using package 2 package 4 to try and get those sex ratios down. So it effectively ended up acting like a harvest control rule where we were harvesting and heavily restricting harvest right up until the thresholds, and then it would immediately flip to the full harvest implementation. And so the next slide sort of lays out a couple of questions for why, and some reasons as to why that might be happening. One was that the number of alternative actions, the harvest actions that we allowed the system to evaluate were limited. It was only 5 possible harvest actions, and they were relatively small amounts of harvest compared to the size of the populations. Harvesting 500,000 male crabs when there's 21 million crabs in the population is a very, very small harvest, and so the system was immediately jumping to that high level of harvest. The knife edge utility functions were called out in the very first review of the adaptive management plan that was done, the first peer review, as the peer reviewers suspected that that might cause problems and there may be better ways for us to think about utility and apply utility theory into the system. And so that led us to, in 2021, thinking about different ways of doing this and trying to improve how things would proceed. And I think that's it for me.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. Yeah, we'll turn it over to Brian. And just a reminder that if you have any questions or things you want a bit more clarity on as we go, feel free to pop them in that question box, and we'll get to them after Brian presents the new ways or the new version. And thanks again, Connor.
Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me. My name is Brian Noose. I'm sort of the new guy on the ARM development team. Started working on this revision, the new version here of the ARM in around 2020 or so as a postdoc. Now I work for a nonprofit called the Bird Conservancy of the Rockies as a research scientist. Okay, I think we can start moving through these. So again, here's a reminder of the schematic of the new revised ARM that we've been seeing. Just to reiterate that what we're talking about here are the components on the right side, the utility functions for red knots and horseshoe crabs, the reward function, the R there, and then the harvest policy functions labeled H. And so all these things are completely or somewhat informed by values. And so that's why they're grouped together on the right side there. So to mirror kind of the sequence that Connor went through, we'll first talk about the reward function in the revised ARM. And with this, we're asking ourselves, what is the relative value of horseshoe crab harvest and red knot abundance in the system? So this has a different form than in the original ARM version. You'll notice here on the right side of the reward function, only utility values are featured. There aren't any of those weight values. The harvest numbers are not directly represented here. It's just the utilities. Excuse me. And so again, those utilities represent our degree of satisfaction or happiness with particular components of the system, the state of those components at a given time. So I think we'll begin with the red knot. Right. So again, our goal here is to maximize this reward. That's what the whole decision model is focused on doing, and not just from one year to the next, but over a long time period, in this case, 100 years. Okay, so before we talk about the utility components themselves, we can look at the form of this function here. You'll notice that it has the horseshoe crab bait harvest utility in the light blue, which is reflected on the y-axis of this plot here. And then in darker blue, the red knot abundance utility on the x-axis above. And then those are added together in the reward. But then there's this third term where the two are multiplied together and then added to the other two terms. And that represents sort of like a bonus term. And the reason that we put that there is to indicate to the decision model that we would prefer that reward be derived not from strictly one of the utilities or the other, but ideally from both of them together in combination. And so when we add that third multiplier term, that encourages the decision model to derive reward from both, because if one of those, let's say the red knot abundance utility is 0, then not only is the second term 0, but that third term is 0 as well. Whereas if it's above 0, then you begin to get reward both from that red knot utility term itself, but also that third term. So it acts as a multiplier. That sort of works to dampen the trade-off between these two utilities, you could say. So as an example, okay, well, I guess we'll just talk about the scope of this entire range of utilities here. You can tell in the left upper corner, it goes from 0 to a maximum of 3. So these don't represent, unlike in the original ARM, these don't represent like numbers of horseshoe crabs. These are just sort of unitless utility units. And so we're trying to get from the redder part of this plot to the green. That's the goal of the optimization procedure and the decision modeling. So now we can break that reward function apart into its component utilities for horseshoe crab and red knot. And here again, we're asking how happy we are with a given value of bait harvest or red knot stopover abundance. And I think, yeah, so we're going to start with the red knot abundance utility. And so, as the name implies, the component of the system that we're looking at is abundance of red knots in thousands on the x-axis here. And then on the y-axis, the red knot utility. And so one detail about the revision process that we went through in 2020 into 2021 is that we did not have the ability to reconvene another set of stakeholder meetings. And so what that meant is that we were doing our best to honor the outcomes of those original stakeholder meetings. And we really didn't have much of a basis to do anything that was much different because we were working off those original outcomes of those meetings. And so we stuck with this threshold of 81,900 red knots as an important milestone. But we had to balance that against some considerations when it comes to the best practices of optimization, setting up a decision model like this. And as Connor said, the knife edge sort of full step function where you go immediately from 0 to 1 at 81,900, that was criticized in the original peer review process. And so we wanted to address that. So what we came up with was basically still a very steep function, but no longer just a discontinuous function at that value. Instead, when we get to 90% of the threshold, then utility starts to rise quickly up to 1. And so when we get to the threshold, then we're at full utility. And this is a really important focus of the upcoming workshop because, as I said, we didn't have the opportunity to ask stakeholders about the shape of this function. We just did the best we could in the revision. And so now we're keen to really inform this with new stakeholder input. Okay, so that was red knot utility. Now the horseshoe crab harvest utility. So in this case, the utility for horseshoe crabs, Connor sort of laid out why harvest is such an important focus in the ARM, because the decision is related to harvest. And here, again, we want to derive the utility from the economic value of bait harvest. And so there is, we could have set this up in a way that would use the actual market value, say, of horseshoe crabs. But because we also had maximum limits, like caps, on the number of male or female horseshoe crabs that was possible in the system, those caps were 500,000 males, 210,000 females. We could set this up as a relative value rather than an absolute economic value. And so again, we use the multiplier of 2 to relate female harvest to males. And again, we just took that from the original outcomes of stakeholder input to the original ARM, that 2 multiplier representing the fact that females should be more or less double the value of males. And then, so in the numerator here, we've got 2 times the number of females that were harvested plus the number of males. And then in the denominator, we have 2 times the maximum possible harvest of females plus the maximum possible harvest of males. And so in this way, utility again goes from 0 to 1, and we are maximally happy when we can harvest at those caps for each sex. So a couple critical question for the workshop here is whether this multiplier of 2 is still warranted. Is that still the number it should be, or should it be something different? Okay, and finally, we'll talk about the harvest policy functions here. And so just want to stress here that these harvest policy functions that we're going to look at, this is basically the answer to the optimization that happens in the process of building the arm. This is what tells us, given a population size of horseshoe crabs and red knots, how many horseshoe crabs of each sex should be harvested. So we want these harvest policy functions to give us an answer, a recommendation over the whole range of possible values for horseshoe crab abundances and red knot abundances. They operate within a range that's set by those maximum harvest limits. So 210,000 females, 500,000 males. That's as much as the model will ever recommend. And again, these policy functions are what we solve for to maximize the long-term reward, and that's what the optimization step is doing. Okay, and in general, these are increasing functions. The higher the abundances, the more harvest will be recommended. And we'll see the shapes of those in a moment here. But okay, so I said that these harvest policy functions are what we solve for, and that's true. So this is sort of like the product of the ARM optimization is sort of a mix of science and values put together. And so if that's true, then what about these harvest policy functions is actually informed directly by values? And one of the answers to that is the maximum harvest of horseshoe crabs. So that's a very influential value in setting the shape and well, yeah, that's the best way to say it, setting the shape of these harvest policy functions. Different values for these maximum harvest numbers are going to be very influential in the recommendations that come out from the ARM. So we want to talk about those at the workshop. Okay, so optimization, what exactly is that? A whole lot of jargon associated with optimization. I'm definitely guilty of using that jargon without realizing it. So we put together just sort of a way that optimization might come up in one's everyday life. So you want to take a road trip and you're starting at one point A and you want to go to B as fast as possible. There are lots of ways that you could get the information that you need to do this optimization, but you have some other considerations that you want to add, like we want to avoid a toll road or the freeway, and then we want to incorporate real-time conditions like weather and traffic. So those operate as sort of constraints on what route we would take. And then we have some the variables that we're choosing over. What are the alternatives? And so you might start by saying that they're all possible driving routes from point A to point B. Some are going to be better than others, of course, and that's the task, is to pick the fastest one. So that's what the optimization tells us. Okay, so the analog here in the horseshoe crab harvest case, excuse me, we want to maximize the sustainable long-term harvest of horseshoe crabs while ensuring the persistence of red knots. That's what we set out to do here. The analog for the constraint here, it's sort of like what the state of the system is now. Where are we beginning from? And then the variables that we are optimizing over, the things that we can change to govern what that are going to affect, or I'm sorry, the things that we are going to change to move us toward a more optimal harvest strategy are these harvest policy functions. And so those could have take lots of different shapes, and we want to find the best one. Which one of those harvest policy functions, which we'll see in a moment, it should make more sense, which one of those is going to give us the best long-term outcome, which is governed by the reward function that we looked at, that long-term reward. Okay, so just to illustrate some of that, we'll look at the male horseshoe crab, what we're calling a harvest factor here. And so you see on the y-axis, there is a harvest factor. It goes from 0 to 1. This is not a utility. It's a very different thing, but it also goes from 0 to 1 here. And again, across the x-axis, we have horseshoe crab abundance in millions. And so this shape is telling us how, as we move up the possible values, across the possible values of male horseshoe crab abundance, how our harvest factor changes. It goes up and quickly comes to very near to 1. So as we try to optimize our decision model using all the inputs that are scientific and values-based, the actual task here is to change the shape of this curve. And as a new proposed shape, or a new shape is proposed, to predict under that shape what the reward will be going out 100 years into the future. And this shape each year is going to tell us what will be harvested. So 30 years from now, there's a predicted abundance of male horseshoe crabs, and this curve will tell us our harvest factor given that abundance. And then we're searching across all these different possible shapes of this particular curve that we're looking at here to give us the maximal long-term reward, the sum of those rewards over 100 years. And of course, we're doing this for female crabs as well, simultaneously. Okay, so again, the harvest factor goes from 0 to 1. It's the thing that we optimize, and then we multiply the values along the y-axis by the maximum allowable harvest. So in this case, 500,000 males. So you could replace, in this case, you could replace the y-axis with one that goes from 0 to 500,000. In the case of females, it's a little more complicated than that. But you could think of this as having that y-axis. Okay, so now we're looking at all the harvest policy functions in the model itself. We looked at the one at the bottom, the male harvest factor. I'm sorry, I said harvest policy functions. I should have said harvest factor functions. That's the male one on the bottom. The female harvest has 2 harvest factors, actually. One depends on female horseshoe crabs on the right. So you see on the x-axis, female horseshoe crabs. And on the left, red knots are on the x-axis. So for females, to get the harvest policy function, we're combining the harvest factor values for red knot and female horseshoe crab here. We're not showing exactly how those get combined. We'll talk about that later, but they get combined, and they together determine the recommendation for female horseshoe crab harvest. Okay, so those were the harvest factor functions. Those are critical to building. They determine the harvest policy functions, but they're subtly different here, as we'll see. But once you have these harvest policy functions, then you know for any given state of the system, in other words, for any of these abundances, whether it be male, female, horseshoe crabs, or red knots, you plug those values in, which are shown down here in the gray boxes in this schematic. Oh, I'm sorry. No, it's the other boxes, isn't it? Yeah. So the pink inform the blue here, and the catch multiple survey tells you your estimate of male and female horseshoe crab abundance in a given year. Then the mark recite data of the red knots tell you the abundance of red knots. Those get plugged into the harvest policy function. Out come the gray boxes, the recommendations for harvest. Okay, so as we said before, the situation for male horseshoe crabs, once you have that harvest factor, is very simple. What you do with that, you just multiply the y-axis by 500,000, which is the maximum that harvest could be. So now instead of going from 0 to 1, we're going from 0 to 500,000, but it's the same curve as the harvest factor. So you can see that rises fairly quickly with adult male horseshoe crab abundance. The blue lines, which kind of meld together into a blue solid block there, those are actual simulated values of male horseshoe crab abundance in the future over many thousands of replicates. I think we'll talk more about that later, perhaps, but maybe not. It doesn't really matter. It's the guts of the optimization, basically. But this is just showing you where the system is expected to be in the future. It's expected to be in this blue blob. Okay, so how do we use, in a given year, how do we use this curve? Well, we go and find where we are on the x-axis. So in this case, maybe we have about 12 million male horseshoe crabs. We look up on the curve and go over to where that lies on the y-axis, and that's our harvest recommendation for that year. Okay, so for the female recommendation, we have two inputs to that, two harvest factors. And so we have a two-dimensional, or sorry, well, it's really a three-dimensional image here, with the x-axis being red knot abundance, the y-axis being female horseshoe crab abundance, and the z-axis, which is coming out at you, being the recommendation. So why don't we find a value on there, and hopefully that'll be clearer. So if we have, in this case, maybe, I don't know, 60,000 red knots in a given year, that's our estimate. And then for female horseshoe crabs, say we have about 9 million female horseshoe crabs. We find where those two lines intersect. We look at what color that band is in the three-dimensional plot, and we locate that on the legend, and that tells us our harvest recommendation. This green and blue blob here, this is showing us, I believe, in the first 10 years of the simulated population into the future, that's where that population is, or the state of the system is expected to be. So this is showing you where for both red knots and female horseshoe crabs, that's the most likely place for us to be in the first 10 years. And so that will become important as we talk about what influences this surface during the optimization. Okay, so that's how we use those functions. Now, just like Connor did, we'll go through an example year to calculate the utility reward and get the harvest recommendation for 2018. Or I guess we already have the harvest recommendation for that year. So some differences here from what Connor showed in our revised arm. We're looking 2 years into the past to find this year's harvest. There's a lot of reasons for that. They get fairly complicated, so just note that's the way it is. And then the survey, it's not just a single survey, but now this CMSA method of estimating horseshoe crab abundance. So in this case, we have, in 2018, we have 36.9 million males, 11.86 million females, around 47,000 red knots. So now we can look to the utility functions, start with the red knots, and we look at the curve. We note that although our curve is less extreme than Connor's, it's still showing 0 utility for this value. So red knot utility is 0 here. That appears twice in the equation, so it goes to 0 in both of those places. Now to look at horseshoe crabs, we need to use our function, our quotient here. So we're going to plug in the number of females that were recommended to be harvested, the number of males, multiply let's do the number of males. 500,000 was the recommendation. For females, 150,000. So then on the bottom, we plug in the maximum possible values, multiply and add, and then divide, and we come up with 0.87. So pretty high. We're pretty satisfied given our utility function. And so to locate that on the range of possible values here, remember 3 is the maximum for our reward, 0 is the minimum. And I think this comes up here. We've got 0 for red knot utility, 0.87 for horseshoe crab utility, and that ends up being 0.87 for the reward. So we're pretty far from our goal of 3. Okay, so now we're going to do more of a side-by-side comparison of the components, just as a review here of the original and the revised arm. So in the original arm, recall that the reward it's informed by both horseshoe crab and red knot abundance and harvest. And the form of the reward has harvest and utility in the reward function. Whereas in the revised arm, we only have utilities in the reward function, and the red knot utility appears directly in the reward function. We also have this sort of bonus term where the 2 utilities are multiplied together to kind of boost the reward when we get when we have non-zero utilities for both crabs and red knots. So the utility functions, in the original, we had these knife edge thresholds. They were used, okay, well, yeah, so we have the knife edge threshold for female horseshoe crab abundance, it's really acting sort of as a constraint in that manner. For the horseshoe crab utility in the revised arm, we're looking at the relative economic value that we're getting from harvest compared with the maximum possible, and that's what gives us a utility. So the red knot utility was, again, this knife edge kind of function at 81,900 red knots. It's not really all that different in spirit, but mechanically a little bit different in the revised version, where we have that same threshold, but a somewhat more gradual function from 0, beginning at 90% of that threshold. Okay, the old arm had this all or nothing kind of female harvest result that came out after the optimization was done, so that you would jump from harvest package 3 to 5 basically as soon as you hit one of the thresholds. In the revised arm, we have a smooth function, and so our recommendations range more smoothly from low to high. This is showing females, but that's also the case for males. Also, males and females are not linked by those packages in the same way. They're freer to give independent recommendations. Okay, so what do we take from this comparison? In general, the ARM framework has 2 kinds of components: the technical ones that we talked about mainly in the last educational session, and these value-based components that are the focus of the upcoming workshop. Again, we showed some examples where we were calculating rewards, say, for 1 year, but in fact, what we're trying to do, what the ARM seeks to do, is to maximize the long-term reward over a 100-year time horizon. And then that's why we say it's seeking a sustainable solution, a sustainable harvest policy, because you can't, as Brian Crawford pointed out, you can't expect a very high long-term reward if you spend all your money on a yacht vacation next year. Similarly, for harvest, if you harvest too extremely in the first few years, you'll end up with a much lower long-term reward. So that is how sustainability is worked into the decision model. And there are some benefits, we think, from this revision that we went through in 2021. It addressed some critiques of the original peer review, including directly estimating relationships between horseshoe crabs and red knots. There's more flexibility in the utility curves, and there's some other points there as well. A major difference was there's just a lot more data available in 2021 than there was in the development of the original ARM. An important detail was that the software used for the original ARM was obsolete by the time we got to 2021, and so we had to choose a different approach to the optimization itself. And there was some evolution of modeling techniques over those 10 years or so, along with the experience of all those involved. And so that all was reflected in the revised ARM. Okay, and with that, I think I turn it back to, Katie, why don't you talk about this? Do you want me to?
No, either way, this is the last slide of this section before we jump over to just doing questions. But yeah, just to kind of wrap things up, we'll just bring it back to the beginning, and that diagram that Brian showed to begin with of the structured decision-making process, which includes this adaptive management component. And so we just wanted to, bring it back to that and remind everybody that, this, as we've shown today, that there have been a number of updates to the ARM framework already, outside of the learning that the model itself is doing. And yeah, this process that we're all going through together right now is, another, type of iteration where we're going to be providing some recommendations for updating the ARM framework. So just, emphasizing the iterative nature of the ARM framework in general and this process as well. So, yes, with that, we can transition into our Q&A session. And we'll have Brian keep the slide deck up so that we can, revisit any slides that folks want to revisit. So as a reminder, please put your questions in the question box. And then we can, we'd like to do that first. Like that'll help us kind of sort through the questions. And prioritize, because we may not have time to, depending on how many questions you'll have, like we may not have time to get through to everything, and so put them in the question box. That'll give us a record of them. It'll help us prioritize which ones to ask today, and then we will follow up after today with any questions that so we did this, on Monday as well, and we had a few questions that we didn't get to. We'll work with the planning team to actually develop like just written responses to any of those questions that we didn't get to. And we'll send that out to the workshop participants as part of a pre-reading package in the coming weeks before the workshop. So yeah, so anyway, so please use the Q&A box. There's one question in there already, which I will read and kick over to Brian. You're showing.
Yeah, it'll be easier to jump around for slides this way than last time. But I think this one is going to be a good one for answering Wendy's question.
Oh, okay, gotcha. Yes, so Wendy asked, can you please clarify if there is any measure of horseshoe crab abundance in the new URH functions? So Brian, maybe you're even ready to take a stab at that one, but others are gonna have, Connor or Brian or any of the other panelists come back and address that question.
Yeah, Brian Noose, do you want to just maybe reiterate? I assume this slide is probably the best representation of that, but yeah, Brian, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So if I'm understanding the question, it has to do with, I think, the utility or reward is the focus. Is that correct, Wendy?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it was because the utility function of horseshoe crabs, this one, Wendy was picking up.
Yeah,
it's harvest and harvest, but then so really the question I think, Wendy, is where does actual horseshoe crab abundance, not just harvest, factor into any of these values-based components? And I think maybe the answer is the harvest factors.
Well, that's true, right? So, and maybe the question is focused on a comparison between the original and the newer version, where the original ARM did have a constraint based on female horseshoe crab abundance, whereas in the revised ARM, the utility function itself is based on the economic value of a relative economic value of harvest, and we rely on the simulation models, the optimization, to ensure that we have sustainable harvest in the future, and that's how we can continue to get high reward because we have sufficient horseshoe crab numbers to support harvest without negatively affecting the horseshoe crab population. And as we talked about, I think we talked about this in the original or the previous educational session, the abundance of red knots is tied to the abundance of horseshoe crabs through the red knot IPM. So although the abundance of horseshoe crabs doesn't enter directly into utility or reward in this version, it's definitely an important component of the simulation models that underlie our understanding of how the system will behave in the future.
Just wanted to also add, if you don't mind, that I don't think that new version is, in that sense, is all that different than the old version. That horseshoe crab abundance of females there was a utility curve related to horseshoe crab abundance in females, but only as a constraint on the harvest reward. It wasn't a direct reward of female abundance. It was an indirect application of a threshold to mitigate or to modify the reward from harvest. And it's also important to note that the whole system is driven on the population dynamics models, which are rooted in the abundance of the two species. So harvest in the dynamics is drawn from that abundance that's predicted. And so it's not directly valued in the utility curves or in the reward curve, but what gives you the ability to harvest. So therefore it is in those functions, just embedded in the population dynamic stuff.
Okay, thank you. I was just asking because there was a question toward the end of the last session. We kind of ran out of time a little bit, where someone asked about the value of eggs in the ecosystem more generally, just as an ecosystem, value. And I thought the answer that was given is that horseshoe crab abundance would be sort of acting as that surrogate for egg availability. But I didn't see an analogous term in the current set of reward and utility, functions that would be sort of either way you cut it, either rewarding or constraining to directly reflect that crab abundance value. So I just wanted to pick us off where we left off on the last session.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. I think that Connor gave a good answer to that, which is that over the period between the original ARM and the revised ARM, we acquired enough data and there was enough modeling expertise that we could build that IPM for red knots that depends on horseshoe crab abundance. And so that dependence was kind of moved into the scientific technical part of the model. Do I have that right, Connor? That was sort of not very easy to connect those in the same way because of the time series of data wasn't as long then, and for other reasons, I guess. But
yeah, the benefits and this presumably was in the previous education session, but the IPM framework was able to link all red knot population parameters to horseshoe crabs. And the previous version back in 2011 only had adult survival linked, quantitatively and formally to horseshoe crab abundance. But essentially, that's what we were trying to say at the end of Monday, and I'm trying to say now is that the value of crabs and the eggs are embedded in the population dynamics models. So the number of females that are out there presumably means more eggs are available on the beaches for the birds, which then increases their survival and increases their recruitment, and then leads to more birds down the line. And so the whole system fits together in that if you harvest too many females, if too quickly, you will lengthen the time or slow your growth to getting to that 3 utility on both sides of your table, because you'll be restricting red knot population growth by harvesting too many females, which means you'll never get to having 3. Sorry, I said utility, but I meant reward. The bottom right-hand corner of Brian's Noose's table, you know, that's all sort of, so the importance of female abundance and therefore the crabs on the beach, so the eggs on the beach, is all linked through the population dynamics models embedded behind all of these utility and reward functions.
All right, thanks for that. Hopefully that answers that question. Kind of a related one that came in. I think I'm going to give this one to Connor because it's about the original. We can stop saying old, we'll say original version. Jane says the justification for the red knot threshold is clear. What's the justification, or what was the justification for the 11.2 million threshold?
That's
how
a
was
really
that
good,
developed?
really good question. That is 11.2 million female crabs is about what we thought 80% of carrying capacity was for the Delaware Bay system at the time. I believe those carrying capacity estimates have been updated, but at the time we thought 11.2 million was 80% of carrying capacity. And we arrived at 80% of carrying capacity as a point at which we would start to add utility to female crab harvest, because in a single species, and I'm not a fisheries harvest management person by trade, so if John wants to step in and correct me, please do, or anybody else, but in a single species fisheries management context, normally, in order to get maximum sustained yield, you would target your harvests at a 50% of carrying capacity, because that's when they are in theory growing the fastest. And so we at the time thought by adding this secondary species as a dependent on the first species, that being the shorebirds, that 50% of carrying capacity might be too aggressive. So we set it not quite at 100, not quite at 50, somewhere in between, and we settled on 80% as sort of a negotiated agreement on what would be a reasonable point above 50% and below 100% of carrying capacity to start valuing harvest from the system.
Yeah, and if this is John, if I could just chime in a little more background on what that 11.2 million came from. Way back, even before we started the initial ARM effort, back in 2007, I was developing a theoretical age-structured population model for horseshoe crabs, and at the same time, Dave Smith with USGS was working on a computer simulation and model of female crab spawning behavior on the beach. So those two efforts were going on at the same time. The population model I was developing was an age-structured model based primarily on data coming from outside of the Delaware Bay, and you know, so just because we lacked any empirical data for Delaware Bay at that time, and you know, Dave and I combined our two models together to kind of figure, you know, if as crab abundance would increase, more crabs come up on the beach to spawn. They move around in certain ways. One female digs up the nest of a previous spawning female, brings eggs to the surface, and then we totally made up some assumed egg mortalities, you know, given how many or given the eggs being, or a crab's nest being disturbed. So when we did that, I put it all together in an age-structured model. We could end up predicting, okay, well, under these assumptions, what might be the asymptote of that if you projected it out into the future. come the time that we started to develop the original ARM model, the software that we used at the time couldn't accommodate all the age classes of horseshoe crabs. So we had to take that age structured model and combine age classes together into a stage structured model. And then we resimulate that and project it out in the future under a situation of no harvest, and selected what we believed at the time might be the best egg mortality given nest disturbance. Turns out that population model would asymptote at 14 million crabs. And as Connor said, through negotiations, we know that in a typical or in any typical population, you're most productive at 50% of the carrying capacity. That's when the population is growing the fastest. And through discussions at that time, so we want the population to be somewhere greater than 50%. And it was just decided amongst all the stakeholders, if the crab population, the female crab population, would hit 80%, we would assume then that horseshoe crabs are no longer limiting red knot population growth. So that's ultimately where the 11.2 million threshold came from. It's really based on no empirical data from Delaware Bay. It was a theoretical model, which at this point in time, I think we should try to get away from any supposed carrying capacity, because any kind of carrying capacity that we estimate is going to be totally dependent upon the underlying population dynamics model and the parameters that we assume in it. So that's why in the new version of the ARM, we don't have any sort of thresholds that say 80% of carrying capacity or carrying capacity, anything like that. So I think the new model is based on empirical, the projection in the population dynamics of horseshoe crabs is now based on empirical data that we have from Delaware Bay, and it's scientifically it's the right way to move now.
All right, thanks everybody for answering that question. Next one I'm going to go to is from Joanna, and I also see your hand up. I don't know if you have a separate question or the same one, but we can unmute you if you want to expand on your question, but I'll read it aloud, which is, how does the lifespan of crabs enter if the harvest each year is independent of the previous years? Crabs take 9 to 10 years to mature. Does this enter the utility factor?
I can take that one.
I was really concerned about the age at which they begin to breed and whether we're not taking into account age structure in the harvest from one year to the next. And so you could have a harvest that takes out a lot of the breeding population or takes out a lot of the younger age group. Is that in any way a factor here?
I guess I could take a stab at that. The age, the length to the length of time to maturity of horseshoe crabs is taken into account in the simulation model, in that we look backwards 10 years for females and 9 years for males. So we look backwards, how many adult females were in the population 9 or 10 years ago, and if that abundance is greater than 3.75 million, then we assume a median or average recruitment of permiparous animals coming into the population each year. If the population will get below 3.75 million, then recruitment in a given year would decrease. To your question about whether age structure of the crabs that are harvested, no. I mean, we do not have an age structured model built into this. Essentially, but we do account for some total number of crabs that may be bled, and some portion of those may not survive the collection and bleeding process. That is accounted for within all of the projection models. It's also accounted for in our estimation of horseshoe crabs every year.
And wouldn't
does that answer your question, Joanna?
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add that wouldn't the timing of the harvest itself ensure that harvest was restricted to post-breeding adults?
It also does, yeah. I mean, just given you know, I forget the exact dates. Caitlin may be able to speak to that, but yeah, there is a closed season where you can't harvest, you know, you can't harvest during the breeding period.
Mm.
All right. Next question. Let's see, is a multi-parter, but let's read this part. So if red knot numbers were very low, let's say 20,000, would there always be some horseshoe crab harvest with the new arm? Or does the new arm have some minimal red knot population baked into the model where no harvest would occur?
I can talk about that a little bit, I guess. If you'll show the harvest policy function there, Crawford. Maybe the actual
Slide
3-dimensional one.
Yeah.
So the answer to that is currently there's not a baked-in threshold or anything like that below which female horseshoe crab harvest is pegged to 0. I think this is one of the items that will probably come up at the workshop. But the reason that is that we didn't do that, even though it would make sense. You can notice here that I guess we get pretty close to 0 down in the lower left corner of our plot here on the harvest policy function. But the critical thing to realize here is that the shape of this surface, the surface that moves from yellow to red here, is going to be influenced most by those portions of this region here, this rectangle, where the system is predicted to spend time. In other words, what combinations of red knot abundance and female horseshoe crab abundance are likely to occur in the simulations into the future. And those are in this green blob here. This is for the first decade, I think. As we move further into time, the blob gets a little bigger, but it never goes all the way down into the left corner of this area here. And so the shape of this harvest policy curve surface here is most important in terms of successfully coming up with a good policy. In other words, one that can maximize your long-term sustainable harvest while supporting red knots. That shape is most important within the green blob. And so pegging, we'll probably talk about what the implications would be for pegging one or other of these harvest factors, the red knot and the female horseshoe crab, to 0. It would basically potentially constrain the shape of this curve within the green blob. And so that's something we want to avoid, because we want to find the best possible shape in that region where the system is expected to be. So that's why we don't force the harvest factor functions through 0, which I think Brian was, or Katie, you were about to show. Yeah, so I don't know if this is actually the optimal ones, but these are examples, and they show how the curves are not constrained to pass through 0 on the y-axis here. But there are good mechanical reasons why we made that decision. But it is something we can talk about at the workshop, I'm sure. I hope that helped to answer the question.
And if we end up, if any of the answers don't fully answer your question, then just put something in the question box again and let us know. I'm going to move to the next question from Brett, which is asking roughly how many female crabs in Delaware Bay die each year during spawning activity, and is natural mortality part of the ARM? Connor, you want to take that one? I see you shaking your head already. Nodding your head.
Well, Brian News can speak to how it's incorporated into the current ARM, but the both versions of the ARM models have survival functions and mortality functions that account for natural losses to the population, both during spawning and then, other factors that affect their survival. They are stochastic, so they account for, or try to account for, variability and uncertainty in what those parameters are. So I will leave it to Brian News, though, to talk about any specifics on the current model, because that's probably the more relevant one than the original version of the modeling.
Yeah, I think John might actually be the best person to talk about this, but there is a natural mortality term in the population model for horseshoe crabs, and that's sex specific. John, do you want to comment any more on that?
Yeah, I mean, the brief answer to Brett's question, yes, natural mortality is accounted for, but within that natural mortality, spawning mortality is not separated out from other sources of mortality. Our estimates of natural mortality came from a big analysis of the horseshoe crab tagging database, and so within that, your spawning mortality. So just imagine those crabs that may get stranded on the beach, overturned and picked off by gulls, don't make it back into the bay. That's all part of the overall natural mortality, which is, the finite rate of that is 20. We expect 26% of adult crabs to die from one year to the next, just naturally. And actually, actually, it is the same between the sexes. When we analyzed the data, the tagging data, we didn't see a sex-specific difference in natural mortality. So it's 26% die naturally each year.
Okay, good thing you were here, John.
All right, cool. Thanks, John. All right, we've got a question from Stuart, which is, what are the current population estimates for male and female crabs in the Delaware Bay region? And I suggested to Brian, I think you can go to, we've got a hidden slide from last time that you could pull up that should have that data on it.
So we'd want to look at the blue lines on this graph, from the catch multiple survey estimates. The female population size in 2024 was estimated around 19 million crabs, and then the males were just under 30 million crabs. And this is premiparous and multiparous animals combined.
All right, thank you for that. The next question is from Joanna. What happens if there are several years where knot populations are very, very low? Is harvest ever zero?
In the current version of the harvest policy function, it's hard to tell from the colors there, but I think you do get near zero, pretty much to zero. But it is, if you can show that it's that lower left corner, not necessarily completely dependent on just red knots or horseshoe crabs. But another thing to consider here is if you go a couple slides down, SDM loop there, the PROACT. So we're talking about the values components here of the ARM. But another thing that is scheduled to happen periodically is that the scientific parts, the technical parts that include the population dynamics models are going to be updated periodically. And I believe this year's is going to be the first major update since the revision. So those updates, they don't change the setup of the arm, but they do change potentially the parameter estimates in these population models that we use to predict how the populations will change in the future. And that can influence these harvest policy functions. So the whole point of having this adaptive management cycle here that can spin around on that orange, the orange dotted line down to consequences, that's what should happen this year. And so that's how new data begin to inform the recommendations that come out of the ARM. And so if you'll go back now to the harvest policy function, if we in real life, not in simulated time, but in real life, began to see lower and lower red knot abundances, the simulation models, the place where the red knot and female horseshoe crab abundances were predicted to be, that blob, that green blob, would move closer to the lower left-hand corner. And as I said before, the shape of the harvest policy function within the green blob is really where it's most important. And so I think part of the answer to your question is that as we learn more about the system by updating the technical parts, the population model parts of the decision model, we would begin, if there were a reduction in red knot abundance over time, we would begin to resolve that part of the harvest policy space better. Right now, the prediction is that the red knots shouldn't reach that part of the harvest policy space. We might be wrong about that, but the fact that we could be wrong about that is sort of baked into the adaptive management process, because we're going to learn about how these populations work increasingly better as time goes on. So I think that's part of the answer.
All right, I think we're good on that question. I'm not seeing any other questions in the question box, but I do see David has a hand up. David, do you have a question that you'd like to ask?
Yeah, this was I was going to ask a different question, but I'm going to ask this one now. The question about natural mortality. Obviously, there's mortality related to the biomedical harvest of crabs. And so I'm wondering if in the same way that natural mortality is incorporated, that biomedical mortality is also incorporated into the modeling. That's my revised question. And if I have a moment, I'll ask you something about the CMSA.
So yes, David, the biomedical mortality is incorporated into not only the abundance estimate with the abundance estimation procedure with the CMSA, because we account for all removals, bait landings, dead discards from other fisheries, and biomedical mortality. So it's accounted for in our annual estimation of the population, and then in the simulations that are used, the population simulations that are used to solve for the optimal harvest policy functions, it's also incorporated in there, and we assume a random range of values in that, projecting the population forward.
Okay, and just a quick follow-up. I know the ASMFC pegs that biomedical mortality at 15%, but do you guys in this modeling effort look across a range of possible values to see the impact of greater mortality related to any of these outside of the harvest itself? Something like something akin to sensitivity analysis, but I'm not sure you would call it that.
We just use, well, yes and no. I mean, we use a constant 15% because that's what's been peer reviewed, you know, and among all the studies. Yes, of course, the studies vary. You know, you see anything from close to 0 to upwards of 30%. So I think it's somewhat baked into our overall range of possible biomedical mortalities in that, you know, we see our average biomedical mortalities over some time period, and you know, which incorporate that 15%, but then just from year to year, mortalities will vary too. So it's somewhat baked in, you know, that sensitivity. So you kind of got two sources of uncertainty that may be going on there. You know, uncertainty in that estimate of 15%, but also uncertainty in the actual numbers that are collected and bled each year too. You know, how much of an effect it has, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, bycatch is another aspect of this uncertainty or unknown quantity. I don't want to delve into that.
We handle bycatch the same way.
Yeah, exactly. I figured as much. And I don't know if there aren't any questions, and there's time for me to ask one more. If not, I can wait until the end of January.
I think, David, just looking at the time, if you could email us that question, that'd be great. And we might just move to a close here, I think. I know some people, it's late on the East Coast and have a hard stop, and we want to just touch base on what's coming. But yeah, absolutely email us that question. We can get back to you. And there's going to be other Q&As or FAQs, I guess, maybe, that Katie mentioned that we're going to put together in a little pre-read for that workshop. So we'd be happy to put that in there as well. But I think the only next step for the participants of the stakeholder process is, yeah, we really look forward to gathering together in Ocean City, Maryland, January 29th and 30th. We're going to, expect to see a little bit of a pre-read packet beforehand with a little more of some of the key questions we want to discuss and some of those FAQs that have come up so far in the process. And just let the planning team, let me or Katie know if any issues or other questions come up in the meantime. Other than that, any last words from Katie or the rest of the planning team?
No, just mention that, yeah, we'll send out these slides to the workshop participants. We'll follow up on the email that I think I sent yesterday, or a couple days ago. And the link for the recording should be up shortly as well. So feel free, go back and watch any of the recordings, leading up to the workshop. And yeah, Caitlin, I saw you come on. I don't know if you have any final thoughts as well.
And not everyone is here, but I just wanted to say, please keep an eye on your emails, because we are going to be sending out, like has been mentioned, some pre-reading materials as well as additional information related to travel. So just keep an eye on that, and we will keep you updated with additional details for the meeting in the coming weeks, and we're looking forward to it.
Yeah, and just last but not least, thanks to you all for being here this week. Some of you went on Monday and today, so really appreciate you spending a lot of time with us. Thanks for the listening, thanks for the engagement, thanks for the questions, and we look forward to seeing a lot of you later in the month. But I think with that, we'll let you go. So talk to you soon, and again, reach out if anything comes up. Thanks, everyone.